David Attenborough once said, "An understanding of the natural world is a source of not only great curiosity, but great fulfillment." And in search of this fulfillment, we try desperately to understand our planet's secrets. We measure temperature to understand our changing climate. We study animals to understand our own mortality. In understanding the numbers, we hope to learn more about the world we live in. But often when we translate the world into ones and zeros, we lose empathy for the reality our data represents. Tables and charts make numbers easy to visualize, but harder to relate back to the real world they measure. What we gain from graphs in clarity and simplicity, we lose in emotion and empathy. And when it comes to decision making, emotions are important. The strength of the emotion we feel impacts the amount of attention we give something, how we perceive it, how much we remember it, and how we relate it to other things in our life. Therefore, a challenge facing data visualization today is how to create data empathy in the way we communicate our numbers. Kia ora koutou. Hi everyone, my name is Kat Greenbrook. I work as a data storyteller in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'd like to share with you a different kind of data viz project to what I would typically work on. The usual output of my work is some sort of graphic design or animation, and it's always digital. It exists only in my computer. And it's amazing what you can create in this digital world. My pre-digital paint and brush were replaced with Adobe apps and an Apple Pencil. These are some examples of my day-to-day work. I like to weave graphs and numbers with narrative and illustrations and photography. I'll sometimes use animation to bring my work to life even more. For me, the purpose of a graph is to enable a reader to understand the data, but I don't feel a graph alone is enough to connect that reader with the world that data came from. So I'm always looking for ways to create or enhance this connection. And as designers, there are certain actions we can take to do this. Choices such as color, language, annotations, and imagery can all help influence how readers feel about the data visualized. Options which are easy to play around with in a digital world. Digital work is easy to share and there's no mess to create it. But sometimes I miss the chaos that comes with a more hands-on approach. When I was studying, my design supervisor talked about being able to see the hand in what you create, regardless of if the work shared in a physical or digital space. And this resonates with me, being able to see the hand or beyond the computer in what you digitally create, even for someone like me when what I create involves data. I remember seeing Amy Cecil's Dado project for the first time and just being completely blown away. She visualized data using Play-Doh instead of a computer. It's creative genius. And she wasn't the only person experimenting with physical representations of data. Alex Wallachek made a New Zealand map out of Lego, showing the topography of the land through Lego block stacks and colour. Stephanie Posvic and Miriam Quick represented air quality data through the shape and colour of their jewellery. Suzanne Furstenberg used white flags to represent each American COVID death for her In America Remember art installation. These are only a small selection of the physical data visualizations out there. I was most inspired by the ones that did more than recreate a graph in a physical world, but they showed their data in a way that could fit into that physical world. And this was something I wanted to explore further. So I needed a project. Alongside my client work, I try to be working on a project of my own. I call these my passion projects. And I knew my physical viz project had to be a passion project because I wanted to experiment. I didn't want any client constraints. I wanted an opportunity to push my idea of what data visualization should be. I had the first idea for this project around the end of 2018. It was a pre-COVID world and we were all blissfully unaware of how different our lives would be in a few years' time. But something I was really passionate about then, and still am now, is how people's actions contributed to climate change. At the time, there was a real focus by the media on another epidemic, the single-use plastic epidemic. If we go back to where it all started, In 1907, the first fully synthetic plastic was invented. It was marketed as the material of 1,000 uses, as it could be shaped and molded into almost anything, with endless possibilities. By the 1950s, the world was producing around 2 million tons of plastic a year. But the plastic optimism didn't last. In the 1960s, the first plastic waste was seen in the ocean. This decade saw people becoming increasingly aware of environmental problems. Plastic became a word to describe what was cheap, flimsy, or fake, and its reputation fell even further in the 1970s. The world was aware that while so many plastic products were disposable, the plastic itself lasts forever in the environment. So in the 1980s, the plastics industry offered recycling as a solution. But recycling didn't stop the increasing plastic production. As we hit the 90s, the world was producing 120 million tons of plastic, 60 times more than what we were making in the 50s. And this continued to climb. There was a slight blip in production in 2008 due to the global financial crisis, but when we reached 2015, we were making 381 million tons of plastic a year. This is roughly the mass of 2/3 of the world population. By 2015, the world had produced a total of 7.8 billion tons of plastic, more than 1 ton of plastic for every person alive today. Of this, 30% is still in use, 6% is being recycled, and 64% was sent to landfill. In the last few decades, we've seen the negative impact plastic waste has on our environment. In 1 year, 8 million tons of our plastic will end up in the ocean, and this pollution has a direct and deadly effect on our wildlife. Over 1 million marine animals die each year from either ingesting plastic or becoming entangled in it. New Zealand is home to one of the great albatross species, the southern royal albatross, or toroa. These birds have a wingspan of more than 3 meters and when fully grown weigh around 9 kilos. Last year, a bird died with a 500 ml plastic bottle in its stomach. The bird was so full it had no room for any real food, so starved to death. Over 90% of seabirds have eaten plastic. This is a worldwide plastic problem, but what I was curious about was how much I was personally responsible for. What was my contribution? If I could collect data and measure this, I thought I could use the plastic to make an interesting visualization. At the time, I had no idea what or how, but figured I'd worry about that later. So I measured my annual plastic footprint, or how much plastic I threw away over a year. Starting in January 2019, instead of throwing away or recycling my plastic, I washed it, dried it, and stored it. Most of it came from food packaging. At the time, the whole process was kind of a novelty. I was riding an eco buzz. By December, though, I was over it. I was also running out of storage space. I lived with my husband and daughter, who was 7 at the time, so it wasn't just my project or my plastic footprint, it was ours. In the beginning, I didn't know much about plastics and recycling. Our house had a bin for plastic recycling, and as far as I was aware, everything I put in there was recycled. But the more involved I got with my own plastic collection, the more I learnt about recycling and plastics in general. In New Zealand, plastic packaging should display a code on it to identify the type of plastic it's made from. They generally look like this. The codes were originally designed by the plastic industry to show if something could potentially be recycled. And it's important to identify the plastic type before it starts the recycling process, because each type has a different chemical structure. The chemical structure of a plastic causes it to melt at a certain temperature, and some plastic types will emit harmful fumes in the process. Because recycling plastic involves heating, it needs to be sorted by type beforehand. So I began with this. I'd already grouped my plastic collection by month, so I sorted each month by type. It sounds easy, right? Just find the little numbered recycling triangle on the plastic packaging and create some piles of plastic. Well, as I would quickly discover, not every company likes to label their products. But I didn't want this to hold me back, or my lack of plastic knowledge bias my data. So when I couldn't identify the type of plastic used in certain packaging, I went straight to the source. I asked the company who had their name on it. This was both time-consuming and disheartening. I'd assumed the rise of more mindful consumers would have meant two things. One, I wouldn't be the first to ask a brand what plastic type their packaging is made from. And two, brands would actually know what plastic type their packaging was made from. Some of them did, but most of them either didn't know or didn't bother replying to the question. So working with what I knew, I created several piles of different plastic types, ready to be measured and analysed. Measuring my plastic presented a bit of a problem when comparing across the different types. Some plastics are denser than others. For example, the polystyrene packaging that surrounds a TV weighs a lot less than the same volume of shampoo bottles. Because of this, I've used weight as the uniform metric, instead of volume or item count. So here's what I measured. My household of 2 adults and 1 child throws away more than 24 kilos of plastic in a year. You may be wondering how this number compares. On average, the amount of plastic we throw away varies by household and country. The average person living in America or Europe throws away 100 kilos of plastic every year, compared to 20 kilos for those living in Asia. In New Zealand, the average person throws away around 31 kilos of plastic a year. It's a scary number, but some of this can be recycled. After sorting my 24 kilos of plastic into each type, we can see just how much of it is recyclable. My local council accepts types 1, 2, and 5 for recycling, so half of my plastic was recyclable. But this left 12 kilos that was sent to landfill. You can see the largest group here is unknown. This is what I classified anything I wasn't sure of because it wasn't labelled with the type of plastic it was made from. So regardless of whatever that type was, it was sent to landfill. It became easier to make sense of my data after graphing it, but I had started to care less about it. I saw the numbers visualized, but I lost empathy for their meaning. When I looked at the graph, I no longer felt the emotions I had while processing the plastic waste. So I tried something different in an attempt to regain my data empathy. A physical data visualization. I thought if I used the plastic to show data in a tactile way, it could help engage viewers with the reality behind the numbers. But for a bigger emotive response, I had to show more than just plastic waste. I had to show the consequence of it, the marine lives lost to plastic pollution, because this is what people care about. And here's where the experimentation really began. When heated, plastic softens and it can be reshaped. I could create something new from my plastic waste. But I had to figure so many things out first. What plastic type would be best to try and mold, what temperature is optimal, what mold material would produce the best finish, what mold size would best represent my data. I made so many mistakes trying to answer these questions. In the end, using a silicone mold and plastic type 4, which would have otherwise gone to landfill, I created small plastic turtles. The turtles give this data a physical presence and introduce an emotive element through their representation of animals lost due to plastic pollution. Each turtle is made from 2.7 grams of single-use plastic waste. Why 2.7 grams? Well, there are just under 9,000 hours in a year. If I split my 24 kilos of plastic waste between them, this equates to 2.7 grams of plastic per hour. Therefore, each turtle visualizes 1 hour of my plastic footprint. 24 turtles visualize a day of my plastic footprint, and 168 turtles visualize a week of my plastic footprint. When creating them, I loved how each one was different. Sometimes the plastic waste I started with looked quite lifeless and boring, but the resulting turtle had colours and patterns that I couldn't have designed better if I tried. In order to visualize my annual plastic footprint, I need just under 9,000 plastic turtles. Something for the moment I've given up trying to create. I personally learned a lot from the My Plastic Footprint project, about my own data and about the physical viz process. But a big takeaway for me, and not really something I initially gave much thought to, was that physical data visualizations still need to be shared digitally. Just because a data visualization is created in a physical space doesn't mean its value can only be seen in that physical space. The real world connection and emotion can be captured and shared digitally. For me, there were just as many lessons learned from photographing this project as there were in creating it. Before I started documenting this project, I took a short workshop in photography. It taught me basic camera settings, how to compose a shot, and where to place any artificial lights. But it didn't prepare me as much as I would have liked. Plastic is really hard to photograph, especially clear plastic, because it disappears into a white background. Usually, when you want to improve your photography, you improve the lighting setup. In this case, though, when I added more light, I ended up with more reflections. And this was incredibly frustrating when I was trying to figure everything out in the beginning. After what felt like a lot of playing around with the lighting setup, I found less light worked better as there were less reflections, and I could edit the photo to bring out a brighter, crisper look. These are examples of the original photo and what these look like after a bit of editing. Photo editing was a skill set I had to better develop. I dabbled in the past, enough to make some of my photos look slightly better. But for this project, I was dealing with hundreds of images, and images that needed a lot of editing. So I had to learn fast. My tools of choice were Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. When the turtles came along, they presented their own set of challenges to photograph. They are quite little, about an inch long or a couple of centimeters, and I needed to capture their detail. Each one required its own Photoshop processing to show them in their best light. It was extremely time consuming. Photo editing is not quick, but I think it was worth it. My original photos weren't good enough to share digitally. They didn't do the turtles justice. If I wanted this physical data visualization to be appreciated in a digital world, it also had to fit into that digital world. And that meant beautiful images. My plastic footprint started in an attempt to understand my own plastic use. I remember back when I first started storing my plastic, I would tell people what I was doing and they honestly thought I was crazy. But I hope the resulting physical representation of data helps expand the idea of what a data visualization can be. The process challenged my thinking on the role data visualization has when communicating. Should it make us care more about the things we measure? And if so, what else should we be trying to show when we visualize data? Visuals can be very powerful in evoking emotion. They can drive us to feel a certain way and consequently act on that feeling. So next time you're visualizing data, ask yourself, what do I want my audience to feel? And the answer to this question may be nothing, and that's okay. Sometimes people just need the numbers. But if you want to motivate, if you want to persuade, if you want to influence, you may need to get people to feel a certain emotion. And that may be hard to do using only a graph.